Hello everyone, welcome to the companion lecture to Common Science Writing Mistakes of Non-Native English-Speaking Students in Taiwan. My name is Vanessa Calaban and I am the Department Assistant in the Center for Condensed Matter Sciences at National Taiwan University. So I decided to record this overview for two reasons. Number one, so that it could serve as a distance learning friendly way to get acquainted with science writing, and that, number two, you will be able to recall this information whenever you'd like as a refresher at any point in the future. So you're probably wondering what this is, why I did this, and how you can participate along from wherever you are. So this is a lecture that I probably would have given when I first handed out the Common Science Writing Mistakes packets, which is the file that I emailed to you along with this lecture. I decided to do this because I wanted to make sure that there was some context behind all of that information that you have in front of you, and I know that sometimes it's easier to hear the words and sentences being read out loud as you read along. So you can participate in this lecture by just following along. I recommend printing the booklet out, the file that I emailed to you. It is 24 pages long, so if you have limited printing resources or if you don't have access to a printer, I recommend opening the file on a tablet or another device where you can read along and take notes as we go. That's actually how I'm looking at the booklet right now. If you don't have access to the file, you can feel free to email me, and I would be more than happy to share that with you. Essentially, what I'm going to be doing is I'm just going to go through this entire packet from start to finish. I am going to read most everything out loud so that you can follow along while I read it. And just make sure that we understand how everything is put together. So if we start from the cover, you have the title, you have my contact information, and then the next page with text is the table of contents. This just obviously gives you all of the items that are going to be in this packet so you can reference them quickly. The first full page of content has the reference sheet. So this sheet contains each type of error listed in the order it appears in the packet. Each entry has an example of something that was either partially or entirely written by a student, and then after it, the rewritten sentence that either I changed it to or what I would have changed it to. The last column has a quick tip or a shortcut for fixing the problem, so that's something that you can remember and think about in the future as you're editing your own papers. This reference sheet is actually how this project started out before I decided I wanted to do this entire booklet. I'm not going to read every example on the sheet since many of them do appear later, but basically this booklet contains passive voice, mixing verb tenses, incorrect parallel structure, overusing commas and underusing other sentence breaks, inconsistent technical spellings or abbreviations and inconsistent formatting, using colloquial language, a or an instead of the instead of a or an, and capitalization errors. So now we're going to jump right into the different types of common errors that students tend to make when writing manuscripts and academic papers. The first one we're going to talk about is passive voice. And if you noticed on the previous page, on the bottom of that chart, I noted that using passive voice isn't inherently wrong. Rather, its overuse is what poses problems. This is a grammar format that people tend to use a lot, and if it is overused, it tends to make someone's writing sound really weak. And that's definitely something that we don't want to do when we are writing an academic paper. So Passive voice is a grammar construction where the object of the sentence, or the noun that is receiving or doing an action, is placed before the subject. So that is the person, could be you, could be someone else. And like I said, while it's not incorrect, it is frequently overused and therefore seen as inferior writing. We tend to use and overuse it all the time. And like I said, this is one of the most commonly overused grammar structures by both native and non-native English speakers. We tend to overuse it when we are describing our own actions or thought processes, or if we are trying to sound, quote, more formal. We want to avoid it because it often leads to unnecessary wordiness, as we'll see a little bit later. It weakens the tone of writing, and it takes the focus away from the subject, so you or the person you're speaking about, and it gives it to the object. Can be good sometimes, but not always. My favorite way to avoid or minimize using passive voice is what we call the zombie rule. The zombie rule is when you take the phrase "with zombies" and place it at the end of your sentence to identify whether you are using active voice or passive voice. So if you were writing a sentence in passive voice, you might say something like, "The experiment was conducted by us." So, like I said, here you're taking the object of the sentence and putting it front and center while putting the subject, which is by us, at the end. So if you add "with zombies" to the end of that, it sounds pretty strange. The experiment was conducted by us with zombies. It just sounds clunky. It uses a few too many words. It just sounds very sloppy writing. The correct format of the sentence would be, "We conducted the experiment with zombies." The more times that you can add "with zombies" to the end of your sentences, the better your writing is going to be. Some more examples. If you see the bottom of the page. So instead of saying, "It was found that the thicknesses of both samples were measured to be the same," we can try writing, "We measured the thicknesses of both samples and found them to be the same." Again, you're taking the subject, so we in this case, and putting it right in the front and center of the sentence. The next one, "The samples were measured by the whatever method," can turn into "we used the whatever method to measure the samples." Introduction of fluoride atoms and thiophene pi bridges on the optical and photovoltaic properties of polymers were investigated. And that can turn into "we investigated the introduction of fluoride atoms and thiophene pi bridges on the optical and photovoltaic properties of polymers." And this one, I think, especially works really well in active voice because it places the verb, so talking about investigation, so "we investigated," it puts that right at the front of the sentence, so you know exactly what's happening with the rest of the sentence. You're ready to hear about what was done in this experiment. And the final one, "The spin pumping induced DC voltage is investigated in cobalt thin films." And again, same thing, "we investigate spin pumping induced DC voltage in cobalt thin films." And this little image on the bottom is the McDonald's saying, "I'm loving it," which is in active voice. And someone has taken that and written the first draft of the McDonald's saying as "it is being loved by me," which obviously sounds very funny, very strange, very unusual, and it is not correct. The next common error is mixing verb tenses within individual sentences or within paragraphs. What this means is that verb tenses tell the reader when an action, a thought, or a subject occurred. And when there are multiple verbs in one sentence or one paragraph, their tenses need to agree in order to give the reader an accurate picture of what's going on. We tend to overuse it anywhere, any paragraph, any sentence is in danger of mixing up verb tenses if you aren't 100% clear about when actions are taking place. You want to especially be careful around the introduction when you're writing about what has happened in the past, and the experimental section when you are writing about what you specifically did in your study. We want to avoid this because, apart from being grammatically incorrect, mixing verb tenses can cloud the meaning of your writing and confuse your reader. They might be confused as to when did you perform this action, or is this an ongoing subject of study? We can avoid or minimize this by keeping verb tenses consistent throughout sections, or at least throughout paragraphs. And then make sure to familiarize yourself with the typical grammar tenses of each section of a standard research paper. In the introduction, you're providing the background of your topic, maybe the literature review or other context for your study, and this is usually going to be in past tense. The method section is often a simple past tense, so it just describes what you did in your study in the past. So we did this, we measured this. The results section, if you're talking about experimental results, they are usually also in simple past tense. However, any figures that you refer to in your manuscript are always described in present tense. So you would say something like, we measured X, Y, and Z. Figure 1.2 shows this. Or please see figure A for these data. And then the discussion usually uses present tense in discussing your work's implications, so the context beyond the lab, and then potential future research opportunities. Some examples of incorrect sentences and how you might be able to fix them. So a student wrote, in our previous study, we observed the same results. So here, as you see, we're talking about a previous study, but the verb is in present tense. So instead you would write, in our previous study, we observed the same results. And then the next sentence, when the component needs to be charged, the vaporized silver electrode would be covered on the insulating layer and then removed after charging. So this sentence begins in kind of a present tense, a hypothetical. So you're saying when the component would need to be charged, so when it needs to be charged, the vaporized silver electrode would be covered on the insulating layer and then removed after charging. So as you can see here, we're kind of jumping around between tenses. We are starting off by kind of using a hypothetical tense, so saying that maybe when the component needs to be charged, either now or maybe in the future, then the electrode would be covered, so kind of mixing a past tense and a hypothetical tense, and then removed after charging, solid past tense. It's a little bit confusing, but a better way to write this would be when the component needed to be charged, the vaporized silver electrode covered the insulating layer and was removed after charging. So this very clearly is entirely in past tense. It talks about a step that was taken in an experimental study and the process that these researchers used to conduct this study. Page 9 is about commas, how we overuse commas and how we underuse other sentence breaks that might be more appropriate, but in any case are certainly more advanced and better for professional or science writing. So as we know, commas are crucial punctuation marks that are used to break up longer sentences, either for clarity's sake or for the benefit of the reader. Students frequently overuse commas when they are not necessary, and they avoid other punctuation that could be used instead. So by that I mean colons, semicolons, hyphens, or em dashes. We tend to use or overuse commas and underuse other things in lists, especially lists that have items that need their own commas within the list, in complex sentences or ideas, and in run-on sentences, or sentences that contain too much information or too many subjects or too many objects to be coherent. We want to avoid this because trying to fit too much information in one sentence can overwhelm or confuse the reader and can really cloud the meaning of what you've worked so hard to put forth in your manuscript. We can work to avoid or minimize overusing commas by using other forms of punctuation. Like I mentioned, you can try breaking up a sentence with a semicolon rather than a comma. However, make sure that you rewrite the sentence so that you have two independent clauses or parts of the sentence that could stand on their own if needed. It is also worth noting that introductory clauses, and by that I mean words like therefore, or a phrase like due to the intricacies of X, Y, or Z, however, in our study, etc., these clauses don't have to be separated with a comma unless the phrase is more than 4 words long. And so here are some examples of sentences that either use too much punctuation or not enough punctuation, and how I would rewrite these sentences. The first example is, since then, this effect has attracted considerable interest, comma, and led to several experimental studies, comma, including X, comma, Y, comma, and Z. There's also a comma in the separating the introductory clause, since then, from the rest. So we've got a lot of commas here. I thought it was too many, so I reworded the sentence to just use fewer commas. So I wrote, since then, comma, this effect has attracted considerable interest and led to such notable experimental studies as X, comma, Y, comma, and Z. So here, as you can see, rather than using these different components of the sentence, so the effect has attracted considerable interest, it has also led to several experimental studies. These studies include this, that, and the other thing. I sort of combined all of that and turned it into a more compact and more efficient sentence. In the second sentence, the values observed in X, comma, and those observed in Y, comma, were close. So here we've got 2 commas and we've got a lot of words that are repeating themselves. So I rewrote this to the values observed in X and Y were close. It is shorter, it's more to the point, and it doesn't use so many commas. The next sentence has a bit of a different problem. The PCE has improved rapidly for more than a decade, period. Next sentence. However, the weak perovskite layer leads to, and then they went on. So here I actually felt that this first sentence was not long enough. So what I did is I combined these 2 sentences with a semicolon. The PCE has improved rapidly for more than a decade. However, the weak perovskite layer leads to, etc. And the last example, as previously mentioned, both PHE and ISHE could generate a symmetrical voltage, period. Next sentence, therefore, the analysis of V with respect to the angle between, etc. And I did the same thing in this sentence. I thought that the first sentence was a little bit too short, and that because it was so closely related to the second sentence, I felt that it could be more appropriately combined with the second sentence for more impact. The next item in the booklet is inconsistent technical spellings or abbreviations and inconsistent formatting. Now, this is probably one of the easier topics to fix because it's usually just a matter of proofreading and figuring out the key spots where you might go wrong with this sort of thing. So what I mean by this is many scientific papers require novel terminology, words that aren't found in normal dictionaries or spell checkers, or ambiguous style guides depending on the field or the specific journal. So any section that deals with technical terms, shorthand, units of analysis and measurement, etc. So in particular, your methods or experimental sections, these are the spots that are going to be at the highest risk of falling into this pattern of inconsistency in formatting and in using abbreviations. We want to avoid this because mixing or misusing terms and abbreviations can look unprofessional as a best case scenario, and as a worst case scenario, it can actually be confusing for your reader. We can work to avoid or minimize this by knowing where to find the style guides for the journals you submit to, and you can usually find these online. By picking a particular abbreviation or formatting style and always using it for every paper, assignment, or collaboration. Definitely check your references lists every time to make sure that names, journal titles, etc. are all formatted consistently throughout your entire paper. And if co-authoring a paper, check that the style conventions that you're using is the same as all the other authors. I find that this is usually where the most inconsistencies happen, is when one author is writing one section and one author is writing another section, and they don't agree on how they're going to abbreviate units of measurement, time, etc. So what I mean by this, so in the first example, we've got a student who wrote 2 hours, spelled HOURS, the entire word. They also used 15 minutes, but minutes was abbreviated MIN. And then 30 seconds, while seconds was just abbreviated with an S. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that I suggested some ways that they could have written these measurements so that they're all consistent. The second example is using hyphens consistently. So multi-layer is one word, bi-layer is hyphenated between bi and layer, and then tri-layer is 2 separate words with no hyphen. And again, on the right-hand side, you can see how I fix those. You can either say multi-layer, bi-layer, and tri-layer as one word. You can separate the words, or you can separate them into 2 words with a hyphen in between. And again, there's not necessarily a right way to do it, but being consistent is the most important thing. The third item on the list is making sure that your title, the section headers for your manuscript are capitalized consistently. So in this example, abstract and conclusion are not capitalized, while introduction, materials, and methods and discussion are all capitalized. And then as you can see on the right, I have capitalized every word. If I was going to write materials and methods as a section head, I would have not capitalized and, because and is not a word that is typically capitalized. And then the last example is something I see a lot, and it's with technical terms that don't necessarily have a lot of consensus as to how they are written. So nanoparticles is a word that I see a lot. Some people write it as 2 separate words, nano and particles. Some people write it as one word all smushed together. Some people just abbreviate it, NP, and leave it at that. And then some people write it as a hyphenated word. I don't necessarily know what the correct one is. I don't know what the journal you're submitting to is going to want you to use. So my best advice is to just pick one and be consistent throughout your entire paper. And then as you can see, the example meme that I used in the bottom is the classic woman yelling at a cat and the cat hissing back at her. But they are arguing over whether or not color is spelled what we call the American way, C-O-L-O-R, or the British way, C-O-L-O-U-R. And again, there are some inconsistencies with what we call American English and British English. So like everything else, just make sure that you have checked about what your journal wants you to do and that you have remained consistent throughout your entire manuscript. The next item in the booklet on page 13 is using colloquial language, or something that we call colloquialisms. Colloquialisms are words or word patterns that mimic spoken English rather than professional or technical written English. It is over-exaggerated or overly simplistic language. Now, this can be one of the hardest aspects of writing good, technical, professional-sounding writing, both for non-native speakers and for native speakers. We generally don't write scientific papers and professional sorts of writings in the same way that we speak. And so knowing how to differentiate between what sorts of phrases and what sorts of word choices are acceptable for scientific writing versus what would be more acceptable if you're speaking to a friend or a colleague or a supervisor is something that takes a little bit of time. So we tend to use or overuse colloquial language anywhere that we might be tempted to relax our writing style, or anywhere that we might be venturing into a new section or a new form of writing that we're not really familiar with. And we want to avoid this because it makes academic papers and scientific papers look unprofessional. It can also be confusing if a term is used that the reader isn't maybe familiar with, like cultural slang or something that can be a little bit ambiguous. We can work on avoiding or at least minimizing our use of colloquial language by reading as much academic writing as possible and paying special attention to descriptive language choices and word patterns. Keep a thesaurus handy as necessary, or a dictionary, and make sure to check the definitions of every word if you aren't quite sure of what the meaning is. So on the next page are some examples. And these are actual examples that I've taken from students' papers. The first one is nowadays research shows ... A more professional way of saying this would be to say today research shows. The next one, we feel it is necessary to report these figures, can be modified by saying we believe it is necessary to report these figures. Next one, very interestingly, a closer look at the evolution of these curves reveals. Here, use of the modifier very is not really necessary, so I changed that to just be interestingly, a closer look at the evolution. And the last item on the list, apparently, decrease J is closely related to light absorption. That changes into we observe that decrease J is closely related to light absorption. So in these four examples, the words that I ended up changing, that I've bolded, are just words that either have a more casual meaning, so saying we feel that something is the way it is rather than saying we believe it. These more casual meanings of words are generally not used in science writing, and the more of these that you can weed out of your writing, the stronger your papers and your manuscripts will appear to be. And I just want to note that the one colloquial phrase that I see all the time, and I personally don't think it's very appropriate, is on the other hand. I have seen that in published scientific papers. So it's not my favorite phrase, but I know that some journals will accept it. So proceed with caution. The next item is misusing articles. And by articles, I mean a, an, and the. This topic is, unfortunately, I think, the most difficult topic for myself as a native English speaker to explain to non-native English speakers. Because learning how to speak English growing up, articles are just something that comes very naturally to native English speakers. And so it's very difficult often to explain to non-native speakers why we would use a, or why would we use the, or why we would use neither of them. We'll talk about my tips for minimizing this in a moment. So articles, and specifically misusing articles, I refer to matching the wrong article, a, an, or the, with the wrong noun. Like I mentioned, sometimes a noun can have one or the other depending on the context, and sometimes a noun doesn't need an article at all. We tend to use or overuse this anywhere in any type of writing, this is an area that everyone's writing is prone to. We want to avoid this because it is a major indicator that there will be more language errors throughout a piece of writing. Like I said, this topic for a native English speaker comes very naturally. And so if there is an excess of this type of error, it gives a clue to the reader that there is something, there could be something else wrong grammatically with the manuscript further on the line. So we definitely want to avoid this type of error as much as we can. And we can work to avoid or minimize it by just reading a lot and learning the general rules that go along with articles. So in general, a or an are used with a more generic noun. So you would say a concept, a method, whereas the is used with something that's more specific, like the instrument, if we know which instrument we're talking about. And like I mentioned, this is one of the most difficult English grammar concepts to learn, primarily because there are no definitive rules. But some examples that might help. So, number one, this was calculated based on a spin-Hall effect. So here you're speaking about a specific effect, the spin-Hall effect, so you change that a to a the. This was calculated based on the spin-Hall effect. Number two, inspired by animals in the nature. Here we drop the article altogether, inspired by animals in nature. I don't have a good explanation for why we don't use an article with nature, but nature is something that is kind of all around us. It's omnipresent, and so when we say nature, we know what we're talking about. An university, because we use a with words that start with consonants and an that with words that start with vowels, you would think that university, because it begins with a U, would be preceded by the word an. However, generally we go by sounds. So university makes a Y sound, U, Y, university. So here instead we would write a university. Similarly, some people precede the word history with an sometimes because some speakers leave off, like my dad, for example, pronounces history like history. And so he'll say an history of something. They serve as scattering centers embedded in insulating layer composed of. And here, because you're only speaking about one insulating layer, it needs to be preceded by an article. So that turns into they serve as scattering centers embedded in an insulating layer composed of. And in the final example, here we examine piezoelectric effect. And again, because piezoelectric effect refers to a specific effect, we need to precede it by the. So that turns into here we examine the piezoelectric effect. And finally, the last section in our booklet is on improper capitalization, or using the wrong letter case for proper or common nouns and verbs. So the difference between uppercase and lowercase. We tend to use or overuse this error anywhere there might be ambiguity, such as a general physics department versus the Department of Physics. And technical terms and names that may be unfamiliar to most readers can also fall victim to this error. We want to avoid this because it shows poor attention to detail. This is a topic that is pretty easy to avoid if the rules are learned and if we have people proofreading manuscripts. So it's just something that paying a little extra attention to can really help improve your manuscript. And we can work to avoid or minimize this by memorizing the rules of capitalization, following previous conventions, so proper nouns, titles, formal names get capitalized, everything else gets lowercase, making sure that you're being consistent throughout your manuscript. And then check with specific journals and their style guides, and especially on how to format document titles. So when you're titling your manuscript, oftentimes journals will have specific preferences or specific rules that they want all of their manuscripts to follow. So some examples. The first one, additionally, silicon is often used. So the rule for capitalization of elements is that the full name of an element, a chemical element, is never capitalized. So silicon is a chemical element. It is not capitalized. So you can see I've corrected that in the next column. In the next example, we have Center for Condensed Matter Sciences. So because this is the title of a center of a university, it should be capitalized. However, words like for, if they are not the first letter of a title, like the or a, smaller words like for are never capitalized. Another proper title, she is a researcher at National Taiwan University. Obviously, we want to capitalize Taiwan because it's the name of a country and a proper noun. But because National Taiwan University is the formal name of an institution, we need to capitalize the entire thing. And the final one, in this work, we use the standard metropolis algorithm, a Markov chain Monte Carlo method. So this sentence had a couple of things wrong with it. In the first half of the sentence, the standard metropolis algorithm. So the name of the algorithm is not the standard metropolis algorithm. It refers to a type of algorithm, and the type is metropolis algorithm. So metropolis should be capitalized, algorithm should not be. And the next section are Markov chain Monte Carlo method. So again, the type of chain is a Markov chain. It is not called Markov chain. And then Monte Carlo method is a type of method, not the formal name. The final section in this booklet is a manuscript checklist that I adapted from a masterclass series from Nature. I thought that this checklist was a really good summation of a lot of the steps that I go through when I'm looking over manuscripts that students have sent me. So this checklist goes section by section and really outlines, like I said, the things that I look for, and so you could also look for them. So it goes through the title, the abstract, the introduction, methods, results, discussion, conclusions, references, and then a general overarching checklist for the entire manuscript. So I can go through those right now. Back to the first section, the title. Is it concise? Does it accurately describe your main findings? Does it contain essential keywords to allow accurate indexing and database searching? So once you go through those three sections in the checklist, you can move on to the abstract. Is it self-contained? And by that I mean, can it function as a standalone document? Does it succinctly state the principal objectives and scope of the investigation? Does it concisely summarize the results and principal conclusions? Does it convey the context in which the results are relevant? And moving on to the introduction, does it set the context for your study? Does it provide a clear and coherent description of the background literature and the contributions of the referenced works to the field? Does it establish the significance of the current work in relation to previous research? Are the scope and objectives of the current manuscript clearly established? Does it briefly describe what you have done? Does it provide a brief statement of the principal findings and conclusions? And then the methods section. Does it provide enough detail for your study to be reproduced? Is it logically organized and presented? Is it appropriately referenced where needed? Is the use of the chosen method or methods justified? Have you used past tense to describe each step? The results and discussion sections are the data clearly, concisely, and logically presented. And within that, have important trends been extracted and described? Are the figures clear, of good quality, and complete with labels, legends, and axes? Are the figure captions clear and self-contained? Does the discussion make clear points? Does it draw firm conclusions? Are those conclusions well substantiated by and discussed in terms of the results presented in the manuscript? And once you've gone through that section, you can move on to the conclusions. Is the significance of the conclusions or results discussed and related to the objectives of the study in a transparent way? Do the discussion and conclusions provide an understanding of how the results fit into a bigger picture? Is the conclusion more than simply a restatement of the same information presented in the introduction? And just quickly going through your references, does your reference list provide a selective yet representative basis for substantiating previous works and claims made? Is the reference list formatted according to the convention used by the journal to which you intend to submit? Is the list balanced with respect to self-citation and citing the works of others? And again, a general list for going over the entire manuscript from top to bottom. Is the manuscript logically organized? So by that I mean, is it clear and easy to follow? Does it tell a story? Is your thesis or your main idea clearly presented? And if so, is it presented early in the manuscript? Are the paragraphs logically structured and connected with smooth transitions? And within the paragraphs, do they start generally and move toward specifics? And do they each contain only one major theme or idea? Are the sentences appropriately linked and structured within paragraphs? Have you diversified your sentence connectors to include different punctuations, like commas, colons, and semicolons, and words like however, conversely, moreover, although, and additionally? Have you used active voice wherever possible? Refer back to the zombie rule. Is the manuscript appropriately referenced with footnotes and/or endnotes? Are terms, abbreviations, units, and scales consistent throughout? Is the manuscript concise and of an appropriate length? Is there any material that can be cut out? And are there any redundancies or overlaps between sections or paragraphs? And last but absolutely not least, have you run spell check and grammar check? Spell check, as I've said before, does not pick up every mistake that's been made, but it will pick up a lot. And if nothing else, it will give you a chance to review the manuscript and any technical terms or anything that isn't necessarily conventional in the manuscript. It will give you a chance to review that and to make sure that you have written exactly what you intend for your audience to read. And so once you have gone through this entire checklist from top to bottom, you can feel confident that you can submit it to your principal investigator, to your PhD advisor, your colleagues, and eventually the journal to which you're submitting. So we have now reached the conclusion of the overview to common science writing mistakes of non-native English-speaking students. I hope that this has been informative and helpful. If there are any questions at all about the content or about grammar questions in general, please don't hesitate to email me. My My email address is on screen, v.calaban@gmail.com. If you would like more information about any of these topics, I have a lot of reference materials that I'm happy to share. The manuscript checklist that I went over, like I said, it was adapted from the Nature Masterclass series on science writing. I'm pretty sure that if you subscribe to Nature, you can actually take that masterclass online for free, so you might want to check that out. I want to thank you all for listening to this presentation. Again, I hope it's been helpful, and if nothing else, just store it somewhere on your hard drive so you can always have something to recall back on if you have any questions or just need a refresher on this topic. So thank you all, and happy writing.